another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. One of the many pleasures of this addictive book is the narrator's excitement in the act of reading. The New York Times once wrote in praise of Danielle Trussoni's work within the pages of one of her many originals, The Ancestor, while the Today shows offered that for those who are familiar with the author's work, all of her books read like they're from an imagination of someone who spent a lot of time in the library and found secrets hiding in plain sight, but where no one else was dogged or curious enough to find. Her Angelology duology over the self-titled debut and sequel, Angelopolis, was an epic fantasy series in the world where nefarious angels roamed among humans, the secrets of their race hiding in old correspondence and scholarly theological texts. The Ancestor was a gothic novel about a woman summoned to her ancestral castle, only to learn the secrets were embedded in her DNA. While The Puzzle Master they heralded as a propulsive thriller interspersing plot twists with actual puzzles, and had equal praise for the sequel, The Puzzle Box. LitHub.com more recently has declared that Trussoni's a perfectionist, constantly revising, making changes all the way up to the finely polished end. As events in her pseudonym release Murder Most Delicious under Danielle Post-Finlay, where the LA Times promised this cozy read blends a clever plot with the author's evocative descriptions of Parisian food, wine, and community. C'est magnifique. And she joins us today from Paris to talk about it all. Danielle, welcome to the show. So long before you had your own book review column in the New York Times, what sorts of stories could we have found first capturing your imagination as a child?
My first book is about my relationship with my father, who was a Vietnam vet. And my family was not bookish, really. You know, my mother loved to, except for my mother loved to read. And so what she would do every Saturday morning is she would drop me and my sister and brother off at the public library and, know that the librarians would kind of watch out for us. And then she would go do her grocery shopping or whatever. And I would end up sitting in a chair in the library for hours, just reading whatever I could find. And so I was reading things that were, I think, wildly inappropriate for like a 10-year-old. I remember reading V.C. Andrews very young, and Stephen King and Anne Rice, and, reading just whatever was on the paperback wheel sitting in the corner of the library, which I find to be an interesting, of course, I had all the kids' books when I was really little. I read all of those in school. But what really ignited my passion for reading and for storytelling, I think, were these sort of big, dramatic, speculative, sometimes out there stories. And the weirder and wilder, the better for me. And that's I think it's ironic because I did kind of do a U-turn and started my first book was very realistic. It was it was a memoir, actually. Although it started off, the idea was a novel, but I do think that my path from there, which sort of veered off into genre writing, literary speculative fiction, thrillers, mysteries, even a little bit of horror. All of that kind of unfolded, I think, from those early years reading paperback, what some people would call pulp fiction, right? Like just these paperbacks at the library.
Now, along the way to graduating the University of Wisconsin, notably summa cum laude with a BA in History and English, and then earning from the storied Iowa Writers Workshop your MFA in fiction writing, whom do you count as any academic mentors down the right road to starting your writing career?
I think people expect me to say, Marilyn Robinson or, the sort of famous teachers that I had at Iowa, but it really wasn't those teachers that inspired me. When I was an undergraduate, I felt very lucky to even be in college, right? I was the first person in my family to go, and I loved writing and took a creative writing class with a professor named Ron Kuka at the University of Wisconsin. And he had gone to Iowa himself. Was a short story writer, and he really just encouraged me, right? He told me, I was very excited about the idea of publishing. When you're super young, I was like 20. I'm like, oh, if I could get an agent, I could publish. And he was basically like, get back to the page. It's not about publishing. It's about what you put on the page. And it really set my work ethic and my vision for writing as something that is a daily practice, almost like an artisanship. So I think I credit him with keeping me real and keeping me writing rather than thinking about the industry too much or what other people think of my work. I felt really lucky that teacher, that professor, I mean, not in a mean way, but really just took my head and kind of like turned my gaze back to the page. And I found even now this was like 25 years ago. This is a long time ago. But even now, it's very tempting for us to get pulled away by by what's going on Instagram and who has the big book this month and what award was given to what author. And actually the thing that sustains a career and that sustains me as an artist is just actually writing every day.
Seems like that's really what it comes down to, doesn't it? LitHub celebrated an early duology of yours, Angelology, as a spellbinding quest novel that traced a clash between the Dark Angels, the Nephilim, and the Forces for Good, the Angelologists, from 925 AD in Thrace to New York in December 1999. Where at its heart is a search for an ancient, possibly dangerous liar that lies at the bottom of the Devil's Throat cavern in the Rhodope Mountains of Bulgaria. While in its sequel, Angelopolis, she continued her innovative neo-Gothic path. Please take us back down the one that explores the roots of this fascinating world that you created on the page for readers.
Angelology, for example, the premise of that was my first novel coming after my memoir. I consciously decided I'm writing something very different. I'm going to write something that's wild and speculative and just out there. And so the premise of Angelology is that the world is inhabited by humans and Nephilim, which are these half human, half angel creatures that are described actually in the Bible in Genesis 6. Goliath is in earlier versions of the Bible, and I think it's called epigenet. No, I can't remember the name of what those basically the pieces of the Bible that did not become included in the Bible. I'll remember it, I'm sure, tonight when I'm asleep. But Goliath was described as one of those creatures. They were giant. They were the product of angels coming to earth and falling in love with human women, and were evil, right? And so this was just a little blip in the Bible. I went to Catholic school. I was surrounded by these stories growing up, and so I just wondered, like, what would happen if we just took this at face value, right? Like, what if the world really did have Nephilim, these half angel, half human creatures who are hiding kind of in the shadows and running things? So it's a conspiracy theory novel. It's the very wealthy are Nephilim, and they always have been in control of things since the beginning of time. And the book opens with a young woman who discovers that she didn't know this, but her parents are part of a group of resistance fighters against the Nephilim. And so she gradually grows into her role as fighting these creatures. So that's that book.
What inspired your voyage with Behan and Khan as they sail from Vietnam to France within the short story Pearl of the Orient?
I've always explored different genres, historical fiction. I've never written a novel that's completely categorized as historical fiction, but I can say that every book that I've written has had a historical element, even if it's just the backstory. I'm fascinated by, someone actually told me this when I was doing an interview, that, oh, you write about the deep past, like in The Ancestor. I'm like, oh yeah, actually I am fascinated by the idea of the deep past, like where we came from and the archaeology, I guess, in some ways, of our world and how things became how they are.
Ingenious and entertaining is how the New York Times has described the journey that Burt Monte takes. After spitting his DNA in a tube and sending it off to a genetic testing site, it's revealed that ordinary Burt is actually the Countess Alberta Montebianco, heiress to a grand centuries-old estate. Before long, she and her estranged but supportive husband Luca are winging it to Italy on a private jet, complete with Italian passports provided by the Montebianco's lawyer. A wallet full of euros and a new wardrobe of luxury goods are waiting at their boutique hotel in Turin. All's fairy tale happy until Luca lets slip that his family's always considered Bert's family tainted. An argument ensues, and despite coming across a scary reference to a monster in the guidebook, Bert ends up taking the family helicopter alone to Montebianco Castle in the remote region of the Italian Alps, before musing that, as any reader of the Gothic would suspect, things go downhill from there. And doing the deep research dive required a mind for every historical and folkloric twist and turn you throw at the cast and by extension the reader from there. Was Bessel the eccentric and tweety family secretary and amalgam of sources who you enlisted as Bert uncovers hidden journals and memoirs, which she eagerly devours as her search becomes more urgent in The Ancestor?
The Ancestor is a novel that was published in 2020, and it's the story of a woman who discovers that she's inherited, that she had family that she didn't know about in the Italian Alps, and she inherits a rundown castle in the Alps. And she goes there, and I don't want to give too much away because it's a big twist and a surprise in the book, but she discovers that her ancestry is not what she believed. There, you know, it's, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. It's a kind of terrifying ancestry that she has. And the book is a kind of classic Gothic novel. Like, this was my foray, I think, into Gothic horror. I was writing the horror column, or it was called Dark Matters column for the New York Times when I wrote this. So I was reading a lot of Gothic fiction and horror, and was really inspired to do a kind of classic female horror story that took, you know, that would take us into a desolate, eerie, kind of gorgeous place. But so that book came out 2 weeks into COVID. That's, you know, it came out at a point when Amazon was delivering toilet paper and, you know, and do you remember this one? And like cleaning supplies and stuff like that. And so the book just disappeared. You know, it had wonderful reviews. It had a full page review in the New York Times. It was on NPR. It like had a People Book of the Month review, but it just disappeared. And so I was obviously a little frustrated about that. And I was also stuck at home during COVID. And so my husband is a director. He does, at that point, he was making short films and he was doing a lot of post-production work. And he's very good with audio. And so I said, why don't we do something together? So I wrote 10 half-hour episodes of a podcast based around this world of The Ancestor. And it's called Crypto Z. You can find it on any, you know, it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. And so I wrote those episodes, my husband cast it, and then directed it all remotely, right? But from high quality studio recordings. So, and it's, you know, the level of the sound is incredible, with really great sound effects and a lot of care put into building the world through audio. And to our surprise, it came out and it was like in the top 10 of Apple Podcasts for a few months. Like, it did very well, lots of downloads. People really enjoyed it. And, you know, that was that. You know, it was optioned at one point by ABC to become a television series, which of course didn't happen because it's Hollywood. But it was the most fun. I mean, it was taking a world that I had written as a novel and then expanding it, pulling out characters and and reimagining their path through audio was so fun, I have to say. And also surprising for me that it worked.
The Today Show admirers are those starring Mike Brink, quipping him in his introduction. The most pop culture detectives have their shtick, and Brink's is that he's a reluctant genius. Following a high school football injury to the head, he was diagnosed with acquired savant syndrome, a rare neurological condition that results in previously neurotypical people suddenly acquiring new skills, plus a compulsive need to display them. Mike's compulsion is solving puzzles that are more complicated than Wordle, or Quirtle, or Octurtle, or Sequirtle, for that matter. This leads him to take on the increasingly dangerous challenges of the Puzzle Master and its sequel, The Puzzle Box, which continues the format laid out by its predecessor. We would love to begin there and ask if you already possess personally a passion for puzzles before committing to write with what they describe as a mix of myth, magic, and mental gymnastics, where Mike has to solve a series of, as the title would suggest, puzzle boxes, which are intricate wooden objects where subtle pieces have moved incrementally. In this case, they're lethal. A single misstep could mean a finger is lost or a poison's released, and how you organizationally achieve actual puzzles for the enthusiastic reader to tackle along with Mike.
The Puzzle Master, and then there was a follow-up, The Puzzle Box, and that's both of them. And So to answer your question about puzzles, I'm terrible at puzzles. I like Wordle, maybe I'll play Scrabble, but conceptually, I liked the idea of a novel being a puzzle and the idea of plotting being a puzzle, which it is for me, like putting all these pieces together. And so I was playing with different ways to bring in puzzles into a book. And the character of Mike Brink came to me. And so I'll just explain him because he's really the key to the entire series. He was a football player in the Midwest in high school, average guy, kind of a jock, not that smart. I mean, did okay in school. And he was hit hard on the field and damaged the left hemisphere of his brain. And what resulted was something called savant syndrome, which is an actual syndrome. Not very many people get this. I think maybe 50 people in the world have been, diagnosed with it, concretely diagnosed with it. But what happens is that the neuroplasticity in the brain sort of goes crazy and allows that person to have skills that they didn't have before, mental skills. So, for example, Oliver Sacks, I think, wrote a few essays about people with savant syndrome. One of those, if I remember correctly, one of those people was someone who was struck by lightning, had brain damage in the same way, and found themselves sort of inexplicably, I'm going to say that again, inexplicably drawn to playing the piano. Would go to a music shop, sit down and play the piano. Wow, like what's happening here? Within a couple of months, that person was composing music and had this real proclivity for music that was not there before. Other people find themselves speaking languages that they didn't speak before. It's a crazy thing. And why I found it interesting and why I wanted to put it as the sort of engine of a story is that the idea that our brain is not contained, right? That we can tap into sort of consciousness or knowledge that's not inside, that's not learned in a typical way. So anyway, all of this sort of led me to create a character who, with this skill, solves mysteries. So in The Puzzle Master, there is a character, Jess Price, who you mentioned, who's in prison. She killed her boyfriend. She has not said a word about what happened. She's been in jail for 5 years. And so her psychiatrist calls in Mike Brink because this woman has drawn an elaborate puzzle and they think that he can solve it. And of course he gets involved and it gets, goes mad. There's lots of adventure and it's a thriller. So, it goes all over the place. But the heart of it was solving the puzzle. And then that happens again in The Puzzle Box, which is the sequel. It's also with Mike Brink, and that's set in Japan, where he is asked to open a puzzle box by the Emperor of Japan. So that's a totally different kind of mystery, but it's also a puzzle at the center of it.
Why did it geographically make the most sense for you to set the sequel, The Puzzle Box, in Japan?
Place is really important in all the books I write, so as I said, The Ancestor was in Italy and Murder Most Delicious is in Paris, and The Puzzle Box is set in Japan, a place that I love. I lived in Japan for 3 years when I was in my 20s. And so it was a really formative experience for me. I love the language, the culture, the people. And I had always wanted to write something about Japan, but I couldn't find, I also don't believe in just like sticking stuff together that doesn't make sense, right? So I had to find an organic way to bring in Japan into one of my books. And this seemed like the perfect way to do it. Puzzle boxes, which are a Japanese invention. I don't know if you know what they are, but they're these little wooden boxes that you have to push them open, and there's like a sequence of sometimes 27, sometimes 50, sometimes 70 moves that you have to do before the box opens. And so in the puzzle box, in my story, there is an ancient treasure hidden inside, and the Emperor of Japan wants it. And so they've asked the most illustrious puzzle solver in the world to come and open it. The only thing is that everyone who has tried to open this box has died doing it. It's booby trapped. There's poison. There's all sorts of things in the box that make it dangerous. So, but Mike Brink is very good. So he's going to be fine.
Now, could you give the viewer that doesn't have one a sense of what it looks and feels like living with a character like Mike Brink over a series versus standalone story? As some of your peers have described it as akin to having another personality in their mind while they're writing.
Mike Brink as a character is very cerebral. And so, and I guess that's a side of me. But then Murder Most Delicious is this other side of me, which, I explore different parts of my personality in all my books. But what I loved about that character is that I understood what he wanted in every scene, right? And what he was looking for. And his way of dealing with the world was by seeing patterns. And struggling to connect with people. Like his challenge as a character was that he always desperately wanted connection with people, but found it very hard. And so, when you're with a character for a long time, it helps you to sort of get to the heart of what you're doing in every scene. And so I really enjoyed that.
The creative pen reflecting recently on the mercurial ways the publishing industry's changed so much in the last decade, and Danielle Trussoni's writer's life has shifted with those changing tides into a new era entirely with Murder Most Delicious, where People magazine importantly spotlighted its location, that a trip to France inspired her culinary mystery. Please reflect, if you would, on the beginning of this new literary chapter and how your real time spent living in Paris was helpful to bring it all into bloom, even in spite of American sommelier Olivia Beach losing her sense of taste to COVID. Before heading there, thanks to a lifeline offer to work for celebrity chef Jacques Debaget at his restaurant, Chez Jacques.
This book is called Murder Most Delicious. It's a big departure for me, as you know. And it really came about because I am married to a French man, and we go to France every year. And for the past 15 years, I've visited the neighborhood that is in this book, which is a tiny little neighborhood sort of tucked away behind the Eiffel Tower, into which, as you mentioned, Olivia Beach, who is the main character, finds herself. Olivia is a sommelier. Not just, sommeliers, there's one at every restaurant, right? They drink wine, they serve you wine. But Olivia is one of the best sommeliers in the world. She's a master sommelier. She has an incredible sense of taste and an incredible nose. I think there's only 250 master sommeliers in the world, right? So she's that level. And during COVID, she loses her sense of taste, which was annihilating for her career. That was it. She loses her job in New York, but she's invited to Paris to interview for a new job at an illustrious French bistro. And the chef who is drinking wine with her, he has 6 glasses of this delicious Burgundy wine set out in front of her. And he takes a drink and he falls over dead. So this actually thrusts Olivia into a mystery.
In the wake of his murder, the neighborhood, even though it's framed in this sort of traditional murder mystery where anyone could be a suspect, has everything cozy mystery fans could crave, the Library Journal promised, including an endearingly quirky, close-knit community of characters, luscious descriptions of French food, and a puzzling plot that also joyfully celebrates the French way of life and happiness. Let's focus in as they do on the casting and crafting of the crime-solving coalition that forms here out of a group of Jacques' friends and neighbors, known collectively as the Paris Neighborhood Watch, including a baker, a librarian, a perfumier, and a florist, who all step in to help try to solve the murder.
She becomes part of, as you mentioned, the Neighborhood Watch, which is this group of Parisians who live in that neighborhood and kind of watch out for the neighborhood. And they were also very good friends with the chef. So, Olivia is the prime suspect. She was the one that was there when he died. And so she has to work with this group to vindicate herself. The neighborhood, as I mentioned, is a very small place. It's just like this little sliver of streets behind the Eiffel Tower. And on those streets, there's a flower shop that's run by a really eccentric woman named Chantel. There's a patisserie that's run by this sort of warm and fatherly baker named Gaston. There is, and this is, all of these are real places, by the way. Like I took these places from actual places in Paris that I've been to, and especially the American Library. I don't know if you've ever been to Paris, but there's an American Library in the 7th arrondissement, full, like 3 floors of American books. And every time I go to Paris, I go and I sort of like get a stack, and I guess I do what I did when I was a kid, and I find a corner and I work there. But there's a librarian, this very, kind of rebellious guy named Prosper, who is a sort of anti-capitalist, anti-globalization, very funny librarian who works there, also very good looking. So there's a lot of like American women who go to the American library who kind of like, oh, this librarian. So there's him.
How much fun did you have coordinating the concert of cooperation here via the technology along with traditional detective novel techniques?
They come together in this really fun way. There's group texts, there's like coordinated, all the tropes of a mystery are sort of in play here, and they work together to vindicate and prove Olivia's innocence. I didn't have a murder board, but I created an outline. Like when you're writing such a tight, this is a rather short book. It's like 275, 300 pages. And my other books are much longer usually. And the mystery unfolds very quickly, like it's very tight. So I needed to know what was happening when the clues were going to be given, which character. I kind of assigned them to characters, and I did it that way. So in the outline that I made, I would have, okay, Chantel discovers this clue here. And, it's a little bit like the board game Clue, which actually is one of my favorite games. I love that game. But the writing of it was really, I have to say, it was the most fun I've ever had writing. I think because I had figured, I knew the mystery, I knew how it was going to unfold. There wasn't all of that tearing your hair out, like, how is this thing going to resolve itself? And so what it did is it opened up for me, the ability to just focus on the characters. I know that sounds strange because this is a plot-driven story, but the characters really are I think, the heart of this.
At the same time, everybody loves a classic detective on the case, and Auguste Dupin and Cat Chateaubriand are no exception as a team. How did you sketch a character's specifics out like those AuntAgatha's.com spotlight as the best detective on the police force, but one who hasn't left her home in years? Much like Olivia and her sense of smell, August's ability to see subtle discrepancies marks her as a different but also invaluable, as the police are willing to step back to a degree and let the neighborhood watch investigate, and in their gentle way the group solves the crime, bringing everyone together at a flower shop for a denouement in the classic fashion. Nothing goes quite as smoothly as expected, but justice arrives in its own way and the murder is eventually caught.
So Olivia is the woman who is the main suspect, right? And she needs to vindicate herself and prove that she's innocent. The detective, because this is a kind of classic mystery, there is a detective. Her name is Auguste Dupin, and she lives in this kind of wonderful home in the 7th arrondissement. And she has a cat, of course. She has a pet named Chateaubriand. And it's kind of a play on words because Chateaubriand is a famous French author, but chat, it means cat in French. So anyway, it's just like an inside joke for those of us who speak French. And she is an incredible detective, not only because she comes from an illustrious line of detectives, but she is agoraphobic. So she's somewhat caged, right? Like, so she has this talent and she needs the clues to come to her. So the whole neighborhood watch, this sort of puts them all in play, right? We have these different characters who are bringing clues to Augusta so she can solve the mystery. There is a police officer named Hetty, who used to be partners with Auguste Dupin and is now sort of in charge of leading this investigation. And then there's his partner, Roman, who becomes sort of infatuated with Olivia Beach, our heroine.
How much of their dialogue play into helping direct that story toward the end of finding out who done it?
Well, they're also different. And so they all have different voices. And as I mentioned, there's a group chat. So I found myself like writing what they were saying throughout the book. And then I realized, why not just put this in a kind of, group WhatsApp group chat thing? And then they are all just speaking to each other very rapidly, right? So the dialogue is a huge part of it. What I think of dialogue as air in a story. I don't think that what dialogue should be the supporting beams of a structure. It should be the thing that's sort of flowing through. And giving us more about the character, giving us ambiance, giving us humor, and the vibe really of a story.
Beautifully put. If we could be your students for the moment, what do you feel are any mistakes a new writer can make with dialogue that weigh it down versus letting it breathe, as you say?
The kind of dialogue I hate is like, didn't you see that knife on the counter? Like this like very like straightforward acts of telling the story. I feel like that's the worst kind of dialogue. The best kind of dialogue for me is the light, humorous dialogue that gives kind of a window into a character's heart.
When you finished with this story, did you feel it had the makings of a potential series?
It's built that way. I haven't started a second book. I think I'm waiting to see how people react. It's hard to write a series if the first book doesn't take off. So I think this book was sold simultaneously in the US and then World English through an Australian publisher who's publishing it in the UK and everywhere else in the world, and it's being sort of launched at the same time. And so I'm just going to wait and see. Like I think it has the potential to be a series. Yeah, but I'm at a stage in my career where I want readers to react to it. I don't want to just send out 10 books into the void.
Beyond this storyscape, what's coming up next?
For a new book, I'm trying to write a new book now, and I'm struggling with that because I haven't figured out the character yet or the characters. And for me, the heart of whatever I'm going to be writing is really the characters. I mean, I found that the one thing that's consistent with me is that I'm changing all the time and that I'm interested. It's hard for me to stay in one lane. And I know that when you're building a career, often your publisher will say, if you're going to write thrillers, just write thrillers. If you're going to write nonfiction, just write nonfiction. Or if you're going to write, fantasy, for example, just write that. But I'm always interested in trying out something that I haven't done before. And so recently I've been exploring writing about a more sort of realistic novel about where I'm from, which, the last time I did that was my memoir, Falling Through the Earth, which was about my relationship with my dad. But since I wrote that book, I have not written another book about the Midwest or Wisconsin or where I'm from or the people I knew. And I think maybe it's because I've got the sort of imaginative stuff out of my system for a while. I mean, not that this new book won't be imaginative, right? There's going to be elements that are typical Danielle Trussoni books, but I'm being drawn back to some of the things in my childhood. So I think it's going to be more like a realistic novel.
We would love if you take fans on a tour before we run your daily writing routine as you're producing these entertaining stories.
I have a really specific writing practice. I write by hand. I have a certain kind of paper I like. I have, 5 different color inks and a fountain pen, and I write my first draft completely by hand. And that has become a kind of meditative practice for me. There are studies done that show that the physicality of the hand to the paper unlocks a different kind of neurological response in the brain. For some people, especially for kids. Like, for example, kids learning now on screens are having a hard time learning, as opposed to how we learned, with writing on paper. And they're discovering that there's a reason for that, because the human brain works in a different way when there's a tactile experience. So for me, maybe because I started writing pen on paper, and then had journals all through high school and really taught myself how to write by writing on paper. When I sit down and I have papers in front of me and I can just draw, it feels like scribbling. It doesn't feel as important, as if I'm looking at a blank page on a computer screen. It feels like I can play. And so I do play, and I found I've written 10 pages that way. And so that's my first draft. And then when I type it into a Word document, that's draft 2. Right. And then I'll print it and read it and play with it. And that's draft 3. Right. So I have a process like that, but it's become a sanctuary for me. Like, in the chaos of the career aspect of it, whether I get published, whether this book gets attention or not, or whether a book gets accepted or not, all of that doesn't matter, because I'm going to my desk and I have this practice. So any young writer, I think, who wants to find a satisfying, practice, that's my advice, is to do that.
Now, as someone who served as a Pulitzer Prize jurist and wrote the Dark Matters column for the Book Review for 5 years, giving you a pretty rounded view of the world of writing, what do you dispense from that deep well of advice you've seen work for enough authors over the years dreaming of being published that you'd pass along here?
My advice is the first and primary act is the writing, obviously, and do that as much as you can. But I'm not going to say that you should ignore social media, because you can't anymore. You do need to have a social media profile, and it's good that you maintain it. How seriously you take it is another question, right? Like, I know some authors who probably spend 10 hours a week creating social media content. That's not me. I do put pictures up and I try to engage, but it's really because I want to connect with my fans. I think you need to be discoverable, so if you have a social media profile, if you're on Instagram, I think is the most bookish of the social media platforms. I was talking to my editor the other day and I said, listen, how important do you think Instagram is, really? Like, you tell me, like, how important is this? And she said, I think it's really important. Even things like Reese's Book Club or Jenna's Book Club, those are announced on social media. They're not really, there's no other platform for it. So all of the book influencers and the people reading are discovering books on Instagram. So having a profile is important. But that said, like, I think that being performative on social media is a real problem. I think readers get turned off by it. I like to walk a line between showing what's happening in my personal life and with my books. I don't know. It's I feel like people, writers who are maybe 15 years younger than us, it's not as fraught. Like, they just feel like that's normal life. But it's been a process of, like, for me, figuring out what that line is. I mean, it's not an overnight thing, obviously, right? So it builds from reading a lot and having a good sense of what you like as a reader. For the nuts and bolts of it, I write every day. I think that, being serious about your writing practice is probably the most important piece of advice I've given anyone who wants to write. We can get, as I said earlier, we can get obsessed with the publishing aspect or the industry aspect. And while that is important, people who ignore that completely have a hard time. I find that the people who sustain a writing career are the ones who are really excited to go to their desk every day. So my advice would be to make a writing practice that you love. Find that thing. If it's, creating a space for yourself that you like to go to and you're relieved, it's almost like this sanctuary from your day to go there and write.
Danielle, it's been wonderful talking today. Thanks so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Okay, thanks so much. This was really fun.